I'm a Senior Vice President of Social Innovation at the Case Foundation. We're the family foundation of Gene and Steve Case. Steve Case co-founded AOL. And we've been around just since 1997. And since 1997, we've been funding civic engagement projects because, you know, the Cases really saw AOL as a civic engagement experiment. How many of you had AOL accounts? How many of you chatted? Used the chat rooms? Well, you know, even though some of those had some other uses, you know, AOL was one of the first times that communities were coming together that were often disenfranchised and couldn't find places together, and were building power and organizing, and is really the precursor to a lot of the modern organizing movements that are taking place on Twitter and Facebook. And so the Cases really wanted to bring that civic engagement experiment and experience to the Case Foundation. And for us, that had meant funding programs like Habitat for Humanity and Special Olympics and Boys and Girls Clubs and City Year, the big volunteer users and the big volunteer mobilizers. But a few years ago, we realized that we, along with the Corporation for National and Community Service and so many others, had invested billions of dollars in this space. But as all of you know, we were starting, this was before Obama, and we're kind of seeing it again, we had started to see declines in a lot of the indicators that measure civic health. We were seeing kind of incremental gains in volunteering, but still staying at about a third of the nation. And we were wondering, what would it take to really move civic engagement in a big way? And not just civic engagement for coming out and doing something's sake, but civic engagement for solving problems. And so we got a friend of ours who had been a program officer in the Strengthening Democracy program at Carnegie, Cindy Gibson, to go out and interview scores of people whose job it was to mobilize others, whether it was volunteer leaders like yourself, or whether it was marketing executives or political executives or politicians, and find out, you know, one, did they think that we had a serious problem in our civic health? And if so, or if not, what would it take to really move forward? And what she found quickly is there's not a problem in this country, as all of you know, with people wanting to go out and get involved and take action in their community. What was happening, though, is people were moving away from the type of community problem solving that had really been a fabric of our nation that was solving problems. And not only were they moving away themselves, but in many cases, they were being pushed out. Institutions didn't really want citizens involved. It's difficult to have town meetings. I remember our former chancellor of schools in Washington, D.C., Michelle Rhee, who I love, but she was doing a meeting one time and she said, yes, we got citizen opinion on this budget process. We had an hour-long budget hearing. And so really, not really deep citizen engagement. And so citizens were being put away. They didn't feel like their voice really mattered anyway. So people were still doing things, but things that they could handle themselves. They were giving food to their neighbors, taking care of their family and friends, you know. And so what we found was a nascent movement that was taking place around the country that was combining the dialogue and deliberation programs with volunteer action to equal change. And I think, as you saw in the program description for this session, you know, those good old 1960s dialogue and deliberation programs are often criticized for being a little too kumbaya, and everyone sits around and has a good cry about what the community is, and then they don't lead to a whole lot of action. And then all of you as volunteer leaders know that sometimes volunteerism gets criticized for picking up the trash or serving the soup, but never really getting at the root of the matter. And so we were seeing some really good instances of these two coming together, and it was showing a lot of lasting action, people coming back and wanting to be involved. However, the examples that we were seeing were very white. They were very Northeast. They were lots of much older people. They reflected a certain piece of America, but certainly not the wonderful diversity that we have of America. And so we decided, let's throw some money out there and see if we could proselytize this model and learn a little bit more what's happening. So that's when we created our Make It Your Own Awards. We put out, it was just a little over $350,000. And we said, got big ideas for your community, want to connect with others, decide what matters most, and take action together? Then let us know what you want to do, and you could win a series of grants. And it was the first time that we had an open grant-making process. Case Foundation had always been, don't call us, we'll call you type of a foundation. But we decided if we were pushing citizen-centered civic engagement, we should push citizen-centered philanthropy. So we had over 5,000 people apply for these awards. awards, which was shocking to us. We let the public vote on the first round. Actually, we had community-based reviewers select the first round, and then we let the public decide the grants. And that was the first time, before Pepsi, American Express, and all these people, that was the first time you had really saw some of these let the public decide. Over 15,000 voters for our first round, and we saw a great excitement, and we got to see a wonderful fabric of these programs taking place across the country. So that's why we got excited, that's why we got involved, and it's really changed the DNA of the Case Foundation. Not only do we do open grant-making programs now, and I've gotten really excited, and that led to our America's Giving Challenge, which I don't know if any of you ever participated in, but we don't do a grant program now without bringing in a community of people that are stakeholders and asking them what they think we should do. It's really just changed the fabric and DNA, because we show that when people feel invested, when they're asked for their opinion, then they want to get involved and stay involved.
You had mentioned that it's so important that citizens own the process, and we've got, most of the people in the room are paid professional staff. And it's really hard to let go and let that process go forward and still be successful. And then the other thing I think for citizens is that they look at paid staff with municipal government, for example, and they say, well, that's your job to keep this organized and keep it led. And so I guess I'm looking for some suggestions on how do we keep citizens as the lead and in charge of it, and strike that balance between how to paid professional staff support that, but also get out of the way.
So, Keith, I'd love to hear from you. Think about it like a board. Your citizens are your board. They're not necessarily running the photocopies or making sure the meeting happens or planning who's going to sit where. They're driving the action. They're convening, how often they need to convene and telling you what they think should happen, who we should bring to the table. So they're the board driving. That doesn't mean it doesn't need experts or staff to help make sure it happens. And also to say to your board, you need to hear about this new approach that came from here. But at the end of the day, the citizens, the board guides it. Would you add anything to that, Keith?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good analogy. I think that it's important to have structure for whatever you're working on. But within that structure, the citizens need to do as much of the decision making as possible. And, at the end of a lot of our citizen volunteer meetings, one of my last questions is, okay, what do you need this to do next? And we, the staff, do a lot of the tasks that have to be done between when we get together and work on the project. But at the meetings, I want the citizens to be putting out the ideas. Sometimes, especially a couple of you asked about how do you get something started, and that's a big challenge. But again, the more you can set up just at the beginning a fairly wide open framework, which they then help decide, and then create a more specific framework in which to work. So one way that we find just really keeps people engaged is that they feel like the board is a good analogy. They're the decision makers, they're the designers, and a lot of times we're doing some of the detailed drafting work in between.
Is there any research into what incentivizes people to get involved in this type of approach? Maybe by age group or by location or?
Well, one, start with our research. I mean, we have case studies on, I think, 7 of the different projects, which goes into what were their ups and their downs, what did they use for incentives. But also, I would really look at the Deliberative Democracy Consortium. They're on Facebook. They have a website, and there are kind of a lot of these specifics. And it really boils down to, what are the motivations of specific groups of people. But across the board, what we found, if people have a good volunteer experience, they come back. If people have a good deliberation experience and they actually see action happen, they come back.
Yeah, results. You got to have results, and that can be some real short-term interim results short of your final destination. We look really hard at ways to get things done along the way. So while we still don't have a citizen participation program adopted in New Orleans, we've gotten a charter amendment, we've gotten a chapter in the master plan, we've gotten a model that has been submitted, and those kinds of things along the way. Another key piece is that there are lots of roles within a project, And different people's interests and skill sets and capacities are suitable for different roles. So we work really hard to have different roles available and sometimes to help guide people towards the roles that they as volunteers can fill. We are not above any number of enticements here. And so, for example, when we had our Citizen Participation Summit, it was 2 long, full days. So we promised them at the end we'd have a lot of wine and a brass band. And believe me, almost everybody stayed to the end. I like to think it was because they were really enthused, but I know that the wine and the brass band didn't hurt.
You know, it's funny, and we've actually found, so the grants that we did for Make It Your Own were relatively small. We had, I can't remember who was from the really small community. We had, was it you? 19,000 people? We had one of our grant recipients, oh my goodness, what was it? Wilson, Kansas. Smaller. I can't remember how small. We had to keep extending their grant because they couldn't spend it all. And so what I want to say is these things aren't expensive. Like sometimes it's about buying some pizza. Sometimes it's about getting t-shirts. We actually ended up letting them use the rest of their grant to help build a playground, which is something that their community decided that they needed. And so this doesn't take a lot of money. It's little incentive that keeps people going.
It was a fun discussion. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Keith, for the incredible work you do in New Orleans and for being here today. And enjoy the rest of the conference.